but then I could hit.
Oh, I would hit cancel. There is, I forgot.
That's what I wondered.
Yep.
Oh, I see. Hi, everyone. This is Terry Johnson. I'm the Associate Director of the GIFT Technical Assistance Program through Indiana Philanthropy Alliance. Today we're going to talk about our Community Foundation Network in Indiana and help you all understand how we operate. But to begin with, I just want to say a little bit about Indiana Philanthropy Alliance. We are a membership organization here in Indiana that we serve all of the different types of grant makers here, including corporate, family, private, and community foundations. We provide training and education for all types of grant-making organizations, and we champion and support the area of philanthropy. So today we're going to talk about community foundations, and I think that in a lot of our communities, if people are not familiar with community foundations, they may think that they're some type of a government entity. However, they are not. As we'll find out later on, they are a publicly supported charity supported by many individuals that provides grant making and leadership to their communities. Many of our community foundations' names begin with their county, and so I think sometimes that's why people think, oh, it must be a government entity because it starts with Hancock County Community Foundation or Fulton County Community Foundation. But we are not. We are not in any way regulated or operated through the government. Back in 2005, the Council of Foundations, which is the national organization for grant makers, came up with national standards for community foundations. And within that national standards, there is a definition of what a community foundation is. As I mentioned earlier, we're a tax-exempt, publicly supported entity under Section 501c3. We are not controlled by any board or any religious entity. It is truly just made up of community citizens. We are supported by many donors. Our goal is to build permanent endowments for the future of our communities. We benefit, in most cases, a defined geographic area, and here in Indiana, it's by county in most cases. Broad-based charitable support for all kinds of charitable activities that go on within our communities, and then we serve in a leadership role also. We always talk that we have three legs to a community foundation. The first one being asset building, which is where we work with donors to establish endowment funds to benefit whatever their wishes are to support the community. We invest these gifts so that they are available to be granted from, they're endowed, and then we distribute those grants based upon the charitable intent of the donor. The grant making that we do with our discretionary dollars, which we'll talk about later on, is really about providing support to the most pressing needs within our communities. And then we also serve as a community leader because of the way we're positioned with our donors and with our nonprofits and with our board members. We come to know a lot about what's going on into our community, and so we can provide a community leadership role in those ways. Here's just a little bit of a history of community foundations. The first one began in 1914 in Cleveland. Here in Indiana, the Indianapolis Foundation was established in 1916. In the beginning, community foundations were set up to be able to catch very large estate gifts as an alternative to individuals needing to set up a private foundation or a charitable trust at a bank. In 1969, because of some of the operations of private foundations, the Tax Reform Act really began to regulate those private foundations, which we'll talk about more, whereas a community foundation is a publicly supported entity. 1976, here again, the IRS started talking more about our public charity status and how we can support the community. And then in the 1990s, because, and this has been a big change in our world, because a lot of the investment firms such as Schwab, Fidelity, and Vanguard saw that donors were using assets that they had invested to transfer to community foundations to set up endowment funds. They began to offer what we call donor advised funds, and many of you are probably familiar with this. Then in the 1990s is when the emphasis on community foundation really began for the community foundation. Here's just a few facts and figures. There's over 1,000 community foundations in North America. The interesting statistic is that between 1990 and 2000, there were about 80 community foundations in Indiana that were established. So if you look at that, a great percentage of that growth of 464 were here in Indiana. Our friends to the east and to the north, Michigan and Ohio, also have several community foundations in their state. Across the United States, about 20% of the community foundations have no endowment, and the average is about $70 million in assets. There's a lot more information under the Community Foundation Atlas if you're interested. So how did all of this begin in Indiana? Back in 1990, the Lilly Endowment, who is such a great charitable entity that provides a lot of grants throughout the county of Marion and across the United States, decided to investigate some work that was going on in Michigan. Right at that time, the Lilly Endowment, which was established by 3 of the family members of Eli Lilly, funded in 3 areas: education, religion, and community. And all across our state, we would hear about all of these grants going out through the endowment. Well, many people from across the state started contacting the endowment individually, wanting to know if they could apply for grants. This is when the endowment really began to think about how can they benefit the whole state and give the citizens within the local communities the opportunity to really be able to make a difference, because they are the ones that know what the needs are. Indianapolis, from their offices in Indianapolis, the folks at the endowment don't know what's going on sometimes up in the northwest corner or down in the southwest corner. And this was this opportunity for community foundations to begin throughout the state in all of our communities. And their goal was that we would establish permanent charitable assets, which has really benefited our state. We now have about 87% of the total assets across our community foundations that are endowed. And here again, it was this opportunity to increase the spirit of philanthropy across our state and help donors, make a difference within their local community. So since 1990, we've gone through 7 grant phases. And so GIFT, let me just let you know what that acronym is. I should have said that earlier. It's Giving Indiana Funds for Tomorrow. So it's just a fabulous acronym, and it really does mean something, and it has done exactly what it says. Because of these different programs, we now have $3.6 billion in assets across Indiana in all of our community foundations. This figure was as of 2017. Currently, we have 74 legal entities, and all of our counties are served by a community foundation. The other thing that the endowment did was that they believed it was very important that the community foundations had technical assistance to help them as they maneuvered through all of the intricacies that happen within a community foundation. And that's where the GIFT Technical Assistance Program was established, which is the organization that I work for. So this is just a map to let you see across our state the various locations where we have multiple county foundations. So you will see down in the Southwest, the Community Foundation Alliance has 9 counties that it serves. Up in the North Central area, the Northern Indiana Community Foundation serves 3 counties. Wabash Valley, down on the West Central section, serves 3 counties. In Indiana, it is we are unusual that all of our counties, in most cases, are served by one community foundation. When you go across the United States, you will find that the community foundations are very sparse. In fact, in Arizona, there's one community foundation that serves the whole state. So we are very fortunate here in Indiana to be able to serve each one of our counties individually. And because of all of the work that's been done since 1990, the Indiana Community Foundation State Committee came up with a definition of our culture. And it began with that standards, idea of standards, that we have a commitment to ethical behavior. We need to be transparent with our donors. We need to be sure that the perception is actually what's going on. We all work together so well as different executives transition in and out. Everybody is very friendly and collegial. We share a lot of our work so that we don't have to recreate the wheel. There is a desire for this continuous learning because outside of Indiana, community foundations do things a lot differently. We really have been raised by Lilly Endowment, who wanted us to build assets for the future. And many community foundations don't have those assets. And we love it when we all do well. We celebrate our successes. So just a little bit about the difference between a community foundation and a private foundation. A lot of people get things confused, first off, in the charitable sector. So in the IRS code, and I'll show a diagram coming up, a lot of entities are tax exempt, which means they do not pay tax. However, there's a subset of them where donors are able to receive a charitable tax deduction because they make a gift to that subset of organizations, which are 501c3 organizations. So here is just the kind of a visual for you to understand that we've got a lot of mutual benefit organizations that are tax exempt, like our Rotaries or our Kiwanis or maybe veteran organizations, but they are not considered public charities. So a gift to them would not be tax deductible. Then you get into the middle where you see the public charities, the 501c3, which is where community foundations fall. And we have to show that we receive at least a third of our revenue from the general public. There's traditional charities, nonprofit hospitals, schools, churches, and government that are just considered charitable because of the acts of what they do. And then you have other publicly supported organizations that also charge for tickets or something like that, and then they also have to do a public support test. And then you see the private foundations up there in the final corner. So private foundations are usually established by a group of individuals or a family, a corporation, and then it's one big fund. They don't do any more fundraising. So examples are the Lilly Endowment, Lumina Foundation, DECO, Follinger. Also, a lot of times people will confuse the Eli Lilly and Company Foundation with the Lilly Endowment. They're two separate organizations, and the Eli Lilly and Company Fund actually is the corporate foundation. They do things differently than the endowment does. But as we talked about before, the IRS has said that they need to spend at least 5% annually on operations and grants. This was to be sure that the money just wasn't parked and people got these large charitable contributions. Many times they have their own specific areas that they very closely grant to, as I mentioned, the Lilly Endowment grants in the areas of religion, education, and community. And as I said before, they don't solicit any funds. Whereas a community foundation, we are made up of gifts from all areas within our community, all different types of organizations, and we have an investment and spending policy that actually gives us the information on how much we will spend on grants. Most of the time, it's about 4%. We have a lot of different funds because we are really set up to fulfill our donors' needs, what they want to do charitably. We do solicit funds. The board is very representative of their community, and community leadership is just something that we do. We work with all types of organizations within our counties to make a difference. Now we'll talk a little bit more about the community foundation operations. And this was Rosemary and I's attempt at getting how a community foundation works on one page. So at the very top, the governing board is who controls the organization. They hire the executive director, and then the executive director takes care of the staff, and they manage and do the day-to-day operations of the organization. The governing board provides direction and governance and strategy. Then down below, we have our donors, as we've talked, and we'll dig into a little bit more as we go forward. These different types of donors give us their assets, which come in a variety of forms: cash, appreciated securities, retirement assets, different types of forms. But all of these gifts come into the community foundation, and they become the community foundation assets. As I mentioned before, our donors tell us how they want to support charitable activities. And based upon what those donors' wishes are, we then determine what type of a fund that goes into. And underneath the funds column is where all of our work evolves to fulfill that donor intent. Each one of our funds is governed by a fund agreement, which is our legal contract with the donors going forward, so that we know how to operate and administer those funds. As I mentioned before, we're set up in most cases to have endowment, so we need an investment policy and a spending policy, and this is how we prove to our community and our other constituents that we have fiscal responsibility. And then based upon those policies, there's two ways that money comes out of the endowments. One is for grants for charitable activities, and the other part is administrative fees, which is the support of the community foundation and their operations. That's really where the community foundation gets their operating support, is from the administrative fees. And through all of this, we're fulfilling that original donor intent when they came in and decided what they wanted to do. Because of our connections with the donors, as I mentioned, the community, the grantees, the nonprofits, we know a lot about our community. People see a lot of the good that's being done, and so we gain that visibility and credibility to provide community leadership within our communities. So the first area we're going to talk about is the board. They represent the stakeholders of the community, very similar to how a for-profit board represents their shareholders. They are the ones that govern how things operate in the community foundation. They give the information to the staff, and then the staff does the day-to-day operations. They are the board. They are responsible for everything that happens through the community foundation. And in all the states, there are laws for nonprofit boards, and there's duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. And duty of care is really being sure that when decisions are made at the board tables, that they're prudent decisions, that they've exercised the reasonable care that they would do as an individual when they make decisions. Duty of loyalty is very important, because this is where we have to be careful that we don't have any conflicts of interest. So when the board members are sitting at the table of the community foundation, their first priority is to the community foundation. It's not about whether they're an investment manager and can I manage these funds, or it's not about being related to somebody that works at another charitable organization within our community that I can make sure they get a grant. Their allegiance has to be to the board when they're sitting there making decisions for the community foundation. And then duty of obedience means that they understand what the mission is of the organization, they provide strategy, and that we stay consistent with that mission. We don't get out of our lanes, because when that happens, then sometimes bad things can happen too. So, excuse me. Let's just talk about the donors, as I mentioned before. Donors come in all shapes and sizes. We've got individuals, corporations, Private foundations, as I mentioned, such as Lilly Endowment, as the Mott, as Lumina, and then charitable organizations. Sometimes our Boys and Girls Clubs or our nonprofit charitable animal center will want to establish an endowment fund within the community foundation to provide sustainability for them into the future. Here's just a look at the sources of gifts. This is from 2017 Giving USA report. As you can see, 72% of the total dollars here, and these are in billions, were provided by individuals, 17% by foundations, 10% by bequests, and then the rest were from corporations. So that just gives you a sense of where most of our contributions come from. Next, we'll talk about gifts. That's one of the beauties of the Community Foundation. We have a lot of flexibility to accept various different types of gifts, which then give the donor some tax-preferred benefits going forward. So first off, we need to understand that when an individual, a corporation, or whomever makes a gift to the Community Foundation, they are not going to receive anything in return because they're getting a charitable tax deduction for this. The money becomes the property of the Community Foundation with no strings attached. The Community Foundation will also provide that acknowledgement letter that the donor will use when they do file their tax return. As I mentioned earlier, here's the variety of different types of gifts we can give. This is what gives us flexibility because many of our nonprofits aren't always able to accept these various types of gifts, but there's a lot of opportunity for tax savings with our donors depending upon the type of gift that is made. Publicly traded stock and mutual funds, if they're appreciated, the donor gets the full value of market at that time. They don't pay any capital gains tax. With land, it's the same way. It's the appraised value that the donor gets to deduct, even if they have, that land has increased over the years. So this is just an opportunity to see that there's a lot of ways donors can make gifts to the Community Foundation. We also are here for the long game. We have a long-term horizon as we look out into how to support our communities today and tomorrow. And because of that, it's important for us to have good policies in place. So those that come after the current board or the current staff of the Community Foundation understand how to administer these gifts and then also are able to see why the decisions were made. We're not in direct competition with the nonprofits. In fact, a lot of times the way we talk about what the Community Foundation does is very simple. We talk about the difference between the United Way and the Community Foundation. The United Way we consider like the community checking account. They usually are working with individuals that give through their payroll, through their income, whereas the Community Foundation is more like the community savings account. We are working with individuals to establish endowment funds, which in most cases is a minimum of $10,000. And so those dollars are going to actually come from their assets and not normally from their income. Also, we want to do what's best for the community and for the donor. And it may be that a donor will come to us, but it's not going to work with what they want to do charitably. And so we try to give them other opportunities to work with other organizations that will help them be able to fulfill their charitable wishes. So we're going to go underneath funds now, which is where the majority of our work happens at the Community Foundation. Each one of these different types of funds operates differently, and we'll talk a little bit more about this later on. So first off, as I mentioned, a Community Foundation is made up of a lot of different funds, whereas a private foundation is just one big sum of dollars that probably one group of people gave a long time ago. So because it is a component fund of the Community Foundation as defined within the IRS guidelines, the Community Foundation Board has total control over all of those dollars. This being said, we account for these funds individually, but they are all pooled together for purposes of investment. Our funds are either endowed, which means that the money is invested, and then a portion of those earnings is given away every year based upon the charitable intent of the donor. Some community foundations, and most, have what we also call non-permanent or non-endowed funds, which means a donor wants to set up a fund and they want all of those dollars, including the earnings, to be available at any time to grant for some charitable purpose. Here again, a community foundation can choose which types of funds it will offer, but in most cases we have both types in all of our community foundations. Some of the larger community foundations now, like Silicon Valley and the Kansas City Community Foundation, a good percentage of their funds are non-permanent funds. They don't have a lot of endowment funds, as we mentioned earlier. So here are our different types. I'm going to go through these relatively quickly, but the unrestricted or discretionary is actually where a donor gives money to the community foundation and they say, we know that you know what the most pressing needs are. And so we're giving you this money to invest, to use based upon those decisions of the needs that need to be handled in our community. The field of interest is very similar, except for the donor says, I don't want to have any say in how the money is given away, but I want you to be sure that it goes to the area of the arts or to education, just a certain area. Here again, the Community Foundation's Grants Committee will take care of the decisions that come from these two types of funds. A donor advised fund is very similar to a private foundation, and in essence what happens, a donor sets up a fund, and then each year they have the ability to make recommendations to the Community Foundation board on where they would like those grants to go. Here again, they only advise and make recommendations. The board is the one who gives the final approval on if those grants are given to those organizations. Designated is very simple. The donor comes in, they don't want to have anything more to do with the fund, and they want it to benefit their church forever, or they want it to benefit the Boys and Girls Club. So each year then a check is sent to that designated organization. Scholarships we're all very familiar with. Back in 2006, the Pension Protection Act came through with a lot of regulations that caused some concern through our community foundation world, because many times family would set up a scholarship fund and they would be the ones to make the decision based upon the criteria. Well, now that is no longer allowed. The family can be a part of the selection process, but they cannot be the majority. And then an agency endowment is very similar to a designated fund, except for the charitable organization uses their own assets to set up the fund for their benefit. And the reason why this is different is because of FASB guidelines for reporting on the audits. So next we'll talk about the investment and spending policy. These are the objectives of the community foundation, and truly the first one is the most important. With the ups and downs in the market, we have to be sure that we invest in a way that we can continue to give intergenerational equity to the future generations, which means that the value of $1,000 today has the same value in 20 years, that our investments and our funds are keeping up with inflation as we move forward. We also use total return. In the beginning, many of our funds only gave away dividends and interest, where now we get to look at realized and unrealized gains as we determine what that spending policy will be. We also need to minimize those short-term volatility by helping our investment professionals understand when we will need money to spend. This is just an example of how our investment and spending policy works. As I mentioned early on, the only two ways that money comes out of an endowment fund is for their annual grants. And so in this example, we're showing 4%, and then their annual administrative fees, which goes for their operating. And here in this example, it's 2%. So right off the bat, we see that approximately 6% is going to be given away every year. And if we want to factor in that inflation factor, and then we want real growth, that means that our average desired return is 8.5%. And over the last few years, as we all have experienced, the market has been so volatile that in most cases over the last 25 years, our community foundations are averaging between 7 and 8%. So we have to take a lot of things into consideration as we build these policies so that we can maintain that purchasing power for the future. As I mentioned with our operations, we also have to be sure that we're operationally sustainable, because we have developed these legal contracts with these donors that say these funds are going to be here forever. And so if we have said this, then we've got to be sure that we are a viable organization forever too. And in the beginning, when we began in the early 90s, we all thought it was about the asset size that we have in our community foundation. So we get to $5 million, we're going to be sustainable. Oh no, we get to $10 million, we're going to be sustainable. However, we have found that that is not the case. It really is about our fund mix, the number, type, and size of funds we have, because each one has a different workload, especially the scholarships. So this is something that our community foundations take into consideration as they figure their fees and the workload that they have with their assets. As I mentioned, and this is a big misunderstanding that a lot of people have, the operating revenue comes from our administrative fees. And so it's normally a percentage of the endowment funds calculated on a quarterly basis, and then our non-permanent fees are calculated in various ways. But this is where the money comes from. You'll hear maybe your local community foundation saying they have $25 million. Well, all of that is not available for them to operate. Most of that is tied up based upon those individual donors' wishes. So finally now, we're going to talk about our grants. And so this is a really important slide. As I mentioned, the community foundation may say, we've got $25 million in assets, which means if they pay out 4% annually, that's $1 million that they have available to grant. However, of that, only $310,000 of that million is really available to give to whatever the Community Foundation Grant Committee believes is most important. Field of interest, here again, that's usually included in there when the committee makes those decisions, but it's based upon that area of interest that the donor determined. And then all of the rest of those dollars, as you can see going down, more than half of this total $1 million, they're already designated for very specific purposes. So they are not available to be used in any manner, any charitable manner. They've got to go as the donor intended. And we a lot of times forget that scholarship funds are grants also. So a distribution from any type of fund is a grant, including the scholarships that go out. And when we talk about our grant making process, we're talking about that with the dollars we have available through the unrestricted and field of interest funds. That's where the Community Foundation Committee may proactively make a grant based upon something they see, or they could be responsive, where they ask for applications from nonprofits within the community and then make a decision based upon those applications. Here again, the 5% rule doesn't apply. That only applies to private foundations. This moves us then into community leadership. And as I said, it is because of our relationships throughout our community with our donors, with our nonprofits, with our board members, that we have built these relationships that people begin to trust and understand that the Community Foundation really does understand what the community needs. Many times individuals will have a great idea about a community project and they'll come into the Community Foundation first, and we would encourage that to just talk about their idea. Because if the Community Foundation can help them, they'll be happy to help them. But if they can't help them, most of the time they know other organizations or individuals that can help them. And so the building blocks of community leadership are our values, culture, and will, that we've got the right relationships, here again, that we've got the right resources, that's staff, that's assets, that we can do this community leadership, and then that we have an understanding of what community leadership means. Here's just a few things to leave you with as we end this webinar series. Community Foundation, as I said, is a very complicated organization, as I just explained. We have lots of donors, we have lots of different types of funds, we make grants, we make scholarships, and we say we're here forever because these donors have set up these endowment funds. So because of that, we've got several different types of policy, which is different from other nonprofits. So this slide is just to let people know that there's a learning curve between serving on the board maybe of the church or serving on the board of the Girl Scouts, and how we have to think about things differently when you sit on the board of a community foundation. Also, as I mentioned back in 2005, national standards were developed for our field. This has become very important in our world today because, as I mentioned, here in Indiana, we have $3.6 billion in assets within our community foundations just in Indiana. And our lawmakers see a lot of these assets setting out there that are endowed. And they're beginning to have conversations in Washington, D.C. about how they might regulate more of what community foundations do. This being said, we are self-regulated because we have national standards. And this is our message to those in our government, is that we do understand that people get deductions for making gifts to us, and we do understand that these grants that should go out every year from our foundations to do good within our communities. So national standards is a very wonderful opportunity for community foundations to be able to show to their community that, here again, they've done the right things, they have the right policies in place, and we are making sure that the good is being done that our donors wanted. This is the closing slide, so anybody that has questions. Rosemary Dorsett is the director of our gift technical assistant staff. I'm the associate director. We also have Jalen Roseberry, who's our program coordinator, Sonia Hallett, who helps us with communications, and Sarah Orger, who is our new program manager. So in closing, I hope that this has helped you to understand a little bit more of how a community foundation operates, and that it's not what you see. In other words, you see $25 million, but there's a lot of complexity to how those dollars are used. But rest assured that there are policies in place so that those dollars are going to benefit the community. And our community foundations welcome partnerships with all of you throughout our state.